congratulations on this film.
Oh, wow. Thanks, mate. I'm a little bit blown away by that.
Well, which I describe not as a fly-on-the-wall documentary, but a fly-on-the-war documentary.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that.
Or a fly-on-the-body armour documentary. Why did you make this movie?
Well, I certainly didn't set out to make this movie. I mean, this is a film that was never meant to be made. If ever there was an unwitting documentary, it's Only the Dead, because I didn't go to Iraq as a filmmaker. And I certainly never had a thought that one day I would be making a film, because all of this story comes from the footage that I shot over my 7 years on a little baby handycam that at first a Texan photographer mate and I bought on the black market in Kurdistan in northern Iraq just as the invasion was about to begin. But I very quickly realised the value of the camera, because I was a writer, and it could remember the things and record the things that I couldn't when the bullets were in the air and the mortars are coming in and the bombs are going off, because you can only scribble so fast. And it turns out these tapes became my visual memory.
Just quickly, just on that point, I really want to know from a writer's point of view how the shifting of the mediums takes place. Because as a writer, words are your skill.
Yes.
Yet with a camera, you found it was capturing something that you couldn't capture with words?
Indeed, indeed. And look, I'm a writer at heart. I still think through my fingers on a keyboard. But it turns out I do have something of an eye, and I've worked with some of the best photojournalists on the planet. That was one of the privileges of working for Time magazine. So I was able to learn from them and see what they were doing, and knocking about with some of the greatest war cameramen of our generation. I picked things up. But obviously the camera could record and capture nuances and feelings and an environment in a way that, no matter how hard you tried, you'd still struggle to describe. And so the camera proved to be, a very different storyteller than I. And I found that fascinating.
Give me one or two examples of what you captured through the camera that you felt you could not have captured in any other way.
Well, the camera would see things I didn't. There was this time where I went and joined these American troops who had been sent to the first ever capital of the Islamic State. And the Islamic State guys owned this entire city of 300,000 or 400,000 people. And the Americans didn't have anywhere near enough troops. And so the best that these guys could do was they were told to keep one main road open, and it was dotted with these 5 little American outposts. And these guys were hit with truck bombs. They were constantly surrounded. They're being attacked every single day. I mean, it was blood and guts. It was, if there's a Kaysan of the Iraq War, it was Ramadi. And it was while I was there that I'm filming with the camera. I mean, it was seeing the things that I couldn't. For example, it was only later when I watched the footage that you see these baby-faced children in uniform sitting in these gun pits, and virtually every single one of them, their finger would be tapping. There's quivering of their hands. And it was the sign of the trauma that they were going through. It's not something that I saw with my naked eye, but the camera found that for me. And it's the dialogue that you hear screamed in the background. During one particularly vicious assault, we were attacked from 360 degrees, and it was on one afternoon when all 5 bases in the city were being hit. And, I distinctly remember, the camera captured for me this kid from another gun pit just desperately screaming, "Just kill people to the north!" And that line lived with me because it was in those tapes. And now it made it into my print story, but, it's also made it into the film. So the camera proved to be a very effective companion.
How do you want people to react to this movie?
Gee, that's a good question. Well, we're trying to give an understanding that no one else has been able to portray in the cinema. And we believe that we've been able to nudge the needle just that little bit in terms of the audience's experience of war. I mean, from your Saving Private Ryans to other war documentaries, we think we've made something that when you're in the cinema, you don't just watch a war. With our film, you're going to experience it and you're going to feel it. So that's the ultimate outtake that we hope. My great aspiration is that there's a moment in this film for each and every individual viewer where the distance between them and the screen disappears and they feel like they're the ones walking on that patrol. They're the ones on that Baghdad street. And ultimately, though, I hope it makes people ask a whole host of questions about themselves, because this film poses questions not just about the war, but about us as people, about human nature, and we leave it for you to find your own answer, because that's the only place you're going to find it.
Now, you straddled both sides of the conflict in this film. I don't know if you were intending to do a Wilfred Burchett, who, of course, covered the North Vietnamese side of the Vietnam War, but although you do get the view from the other side, I don't know if it was intentional, but the understanding you get of the guys fighting the Americans is pretty much in line with what you thought beforehand, that they are basically barbarians with guns and knives.
Well, certainly the guys that we now call the Islamic State, these are people you cannot negotiate with. And I've got to tell you, it's quite something to sit down with one of those Islamic State fighters or one of their commanders and be sitting across the table and looking them in the eye. I had an insurgent commander friend of mine, a guy who himself was fighting the Americans, but he wasn't part of the Islamic State. At one point, like so many others, he contemplated drifting over to the Islamic State guys. I catch up with him a few weeks later and I said, so how did that meeting go? And he goes, this is a man who's a fighter who's been fighting for 2 decades and he's been fighting the Americans at this point for 3 years. And he sat down and he said to me, those jihadis, he goes, it's as if they're from another planet. You don't know what they're thinking from one second to the next. He said, they don't even trust their own clothes. Now, this was an Iraqi insurgent. This is a former military officer from the Iraqi army who was fighting, as he saw it, to free his country of a foreign occupier. Very different to these guys fighting these holy wars. And that's one of the things that obviously I discovered when I crossed over to the other side. There wasn't just one war in Iraq. There was at least 4. There was the war against the Iraqi insurgents, these ex-military fighting to free their country and fighting for a seat at the political table of power. Then there was the holy war with the people we now call the Islamic State. Then there was the war between the Iraqis themselves, the civil war. And finally, there was Iran's soft war against everyone else named above. And it was only by going out there into the ether and meeting these people was I able to learn this. Learn what the American military at that point did not know. The difference between Wilfred Burchett and I is that Wilfred Burchett, I believe, was a believer. He believed in the North Vietnamese cause. My job as a journalist isn't to believe, it isn't to be an activist. It's to find all sides of the story, gather all the information, and try and distill it down to one tiny fragment of the greater truth. And that's what I was trying to do. And it illuminated the whole war for the rest of the world.
Now, you've deliberately spent a lot of time in the film with the American troops. Mm-hmm. And as with the time that you spent with the rebels, the insurgents, in that basically confirms what you suspect about them, I have to say that the time that you spend with the American soldiers does the same thing. They come across as being incredibly courageous, brave, gutsy, scared, human, but ultimately, heart heartfelt warriors who are there doing the best job they can, but often doing things that even you were taken aback by in terms of courage, going into dark rooms and engaging in hand-to-hand combat in the dark.
Yeah, well, I've had the privilege of being an Australian civilian who's nominated an American soldier for a whole host of bravery awards, medals that he has received. In fact, he was even nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor. What you see with the American experience in our film is that, like all wars, these soldiers and Marines are babies because it's our children that we send to war. I mean, that's what strikes you over and over again when you see these kids, is that they're kids, these baby faces. And let's not forget, for a soldier's war becomes the 200 yards of street right there in front of him. And when they're in that kind of line of fire, the reasons that they were sent there disappear. Who sent them there no longer matters. They're not fighting for a greater noble idea of God, king and country, or even democracy, because in the end, a soldier's war is about fighting for the man next to him, his brother. And the love you see between these troops is incredible.
Did this experience enhance your respect for the average fighting stiff?
Oh, of course. Look, there's something to be said for any man or woman who's willing to put on a uniform of any kind from any country and to go and defend their country. What did George Orwell say? It's about hard men standing on a wall at night ready to do great and terrible violence is why we can sleep. So you have to give respect to anyone who's willing to do that. And, let's not forget, in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was unlike Vietnam. They're all professional soldiers or Marines. There were no conscripts. There were National Guardsmen and reservists, but every one of them at some point signed on the dotted line. So they're professional troops, and you see that. And look, as you know, the footage that we have is the most intimate and intense combat footage that has ever been shot or seen out of the Iraq War, without question.
Just quickly, given what you said before about how you want audience members to take away what their own reaction to the film, how would you respond to the feeling that this film can very promptly be interpreted as a red state view of the war, in that people will see it and go, you know what, for their faults, and you do show the faults, the Americans are over there fighting the good fight. They are brave men doing a good job. That is a reading that can very much be taken away from that film. Does that bother you in any way?
Well, no, it doesn't, because there's also a very liberal viewing of that film, in that you see these poor American kids sent to this foreign country where they look like aliens with all the body armour and equipment, bursting into these innocent families' homes and terrifying the kids. And every now and then we're accidentally killing some of these poor innocents. You also see, how we got it all so wrong. So there's a conservative view you can take of this film. There's also a very liberal view. You could also take a very anti-American view. You can take a very anti-extremist view. You can also take away, a very peacemaker view. But that is war, though, because there's no one answer. There's no one true story. And the reception in the United States to this film so far has cut across all political divides, and people of all sorts of political persuasions and backgrounds are taking all sorts of different things from it. And I think that's the greatest accolade that we can have, because that's the complexity, and because none of these things are black and white.
I'm keen to know about the issue of invisibility. Now, you show brutality on the insurgent side, some pretty shocking footage. But there was also the scene towards the end
Yeah.
where they're basically just waiting for one of their enemy, and he is an enemy.
Well, we
as
don't
they
know.
conf-
We don't know if he was an
okay.
enemy. He could have been a farm kid running home from the fields at the arrival of the Americans.
He's got magazines.
Under
in his
every
pockets.
Iraqi house has one AK-47 and 2 fully loaded magazines by Iraqi law.
Okay.
And I have to say, I don't know too many insurgents running around with their ID in their pocket. That said, he very much could be an enemy combatant, and it was very much a legitimate shoot. Because what you're touching upon is the fact that in this scene, as you see in so many other parts of the film and I experienced in the war, I saw good men do evil, and I saw evil men do good.
Well, in this particular sequence, they've mortally wounded the guy, and they've dragged him into a compound, and they're basically laying him down there, and they're essentially waiting for him to die. Now, you comment on how you felt by not saying anything, and the camera is just drifting around these guys. They are completely oblivious to your presence.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, they must have been totally aware that you were recording the way they were reacting to this dying man.
Yeah, well, and let's not forget, that was a clear breach of the Geneva Conventions. You know, once you take an enemy combatant into your custody, you must give him all the medical aid that he needs. Not only did we in that courtyard fail to do that, in some ways we made his passing more difficult. And what I was doing was, you know, trying to capture this moment. And what I realised as I was filming is that I'd become as indifferent to this man's suffering as the soldiers around me whose indifference I was attempting to capture. But that's obviously the hardest thing out there, isn't it? To disappear as a cameraman, as a photographer, as a writer. But that's something, I don't know, for some reason, somehow I was able to do, particularly when I was with the troops, because, you know, I had such a special bond with all the troops. And, you know, as the years and years that I was there 7 years, you know, the military really came to adopt me. And, you know, I became one of them in so many ways. But at the same token, I also became an Iraqi because I was living with the Iraqis and I was able to blend into their society too. So you hit upon a good point. It's a magical ability to disappear that to this day I can't explain.
Well, might sound a bit bizarre, but you talk in the film, at the beginning of the film, about how you discover dark parts of your own soul through this experience. I put it to you that one of the darkest parts of your soul that you discovered, especially in relation to that last sequence, is that you actually become a pure journalist, completely impartial, completely indifferent
Absolutely.
to what you are recording.
No, you're dead right about that. Journalistically, in terms of our professional ethics, I did absolutely the right thing. And I did it because I'd made that decision years before that incident in that compound that journalists are not meant to be actors or players in the story. And I've got to say, you know, these days, too many of our journalists forget that and want to become a part of the story. Well, that's not our role. We're there to observe and to record, and through one incident or one man's passing, hopefully amplify a much greater point. So, yeah, journalistically, I was doing my job, and I knew that. And intellectually, I'd hardened myself to that. But then there's the human element. I mean, by the time we have this scene in this courtyard where we've dragged this guy who's been shot, and he is slowly dying in front of us, and no one even gives him a Band-Aid, even though within 11 minutes he could have been on a surgeon's table. And the surgeon who watched that film was very upset that he wasn't sent there. By that stage, in that courtyard with these American troops, I was certainly the oldest man in the courtyard. And at that point, I'd had the most combat experience of anyone. All I would have had to do was clear my throat, let alone say something, and those troops would have at least had to pretend to, if not actually give him medical aid. And while I was filming, I knew that I could have done that, but I didn't. And so I have to accept a moral responsibility for by my silence, my participation in that event. And that's when I found that dark chamber of my heart. Because we all have them, mate. We all have light and dark inside us. Joseph Conrad wrote about it in the 1890s in The Heart of Darkness. Francis Ford Coppola turned the same story into Apocalypse Now in 1979. And it turns out this bumbling Aussie journo running around Iraq with a camera accidentally filmed the same story for real in the Iraq War.
Michael, I'm just going to hit you with two more questions. We could talk for another hour, but we don't have the studio time.
We never do, mate.
Just firstly, there was a point where you were facing execution.
Yeah.
You were going to be beheaded.
Yeah.
After you were captured by the insurgents.
Yeah, well, by the guys who are now the Islamic State.
Right,
yes,
right.
not by. Yeah.
Sorry, but an insurgent friend essentially talked them out of it.
Saved me. Yeah.
Right. Why didn't you get on the first plane back home?
Yeah. Well, that's an.
Are you insane?
That's the obvious question, right? And you know that's would have been virtually anyone else's reaction. But by that point, you know, the war had become my home. The war had become my normal. And the story was not yet done. And there was a huge piece of that story that I was the only one who was, you know, able to tell that part of that story. You know, I felt a great obligation to stay in Iraq because after that incident in 2004, I stayed another 4 or 5 years. So why didn't I come home after I was almost beheaded by the guys who are now the Islamic State? It's because my job wasn't over. And to be perfectly honest, just between you and me, I don't think I knew how to come home.
You have a family now?
Yes, I do.
Tell me about the family.
I'm always very cautious about not giving away too many personal details because obviously I've had a lot of security threats over the years. But yeah, I had a young son who was born on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, and I'm very pleased to say that I've recently had a baby girl.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, mate. So look, you know, I have found life again.
The reason why I ask that is because would you take these sorts of risks ever again?
Not now, no. You know, what I did in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Lebanon when the Israelis invaded, in Georgia when the Russians invaded, they were things that I could only do at that time of my life, and because I felt that it was the time demanded that of me. That moment in history needed that to be done. You know, I've given it the office. I did 10 years covering our so-called wars on terror. You know, and that doesn't come without a cost, obviously. And so, no, I wouldn't do it again now. I hope I wouldn't have to make those choices again now.